It's time for the Douglas Coleman Show. Mr. Smooth and Savvy is joined by guests from all walks of life. From the entertainment industry to authors to political and social commentators. The famous and not so famous. The controversial and the light and fluffy. We have it all. Now, here is Douglas Coleman.
Howdy, howdy, ho. Hey, 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 hee, 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 ha. Welcome to the Douglas Coleman Show. It's me, Douglas Coleman. How are you? How are you? We've got a good show for you today. It's a full-hour interview with a Mr. Tim Rymel. Tim served as an evangelical Christian minister for nearly 25 years, including 6 years at what was once the world's oldest and most renowned ex-gay ministry. There was something else called Pray the Gay Away. I've heard of that one. Tim is also a conversion therapy survivor. He's the author of the upcoming book Rethinking Everything, When Faith and Reality Don't Make Sense. It's due out in the fall. He's also got two other books that are out. One is called Going Gay, which came out in 2014, and a business book called Everything I Learned About Management I Learned from Having a Kindergartner. I still get a chuckle out of that title. That came out in 2012, both available at Amazon.com. So, we got a short commercial break, and then the interview with Tim Rymel.
You're listening to Mr. Smooth and Savvy, right here on the Douglas Coleman Show. We'll be right back after these commercial messages.
Tired of living in a culture of lies, fake news, and alternative facts? The Pro-Truth Pledge reverses the tide of lies by calling on politicians, and everyone else, to commit to truth-oriented behaviors. The pledge asks signees to commit to 12 behaviors that research in behavioral science shows lead to truthfulness, such as clarifying one's opinions and the facts, citing one's sources, and celebrating people who update their beliefs toward the truth. Private citizens who sign the pledge get the benefit of contributing to a more truth-oriented society. Public figures get more substantive rewards for signing the pledge in the form of positive media and public recognition. The pledge crowdsources the truth by asking volunteers to evaluate the statements of public figures who sign the pledge. Take the pledge, demand that your elected representatives do so, and encourage your friends to take it at protruthpledge.org.
Hi there, this is Stuart Epps from the UK, record producer, engineer. You might have heard of me. I've worked with artists from Elton John to Led Zeppelin to Bad Company, Twisted Sister, Robbie Williams, Oasis, many, many great bands and artists in the past and the present and hopefully in the future. But you can work with me as well. You know, all you got to do is get in touch with me on epsmusicproductions.com. That's EWPSproductionsmusic.com. And I can help you with your productions and with your recordings. A lot of people do home recordings now, which you can only take so far. Maybe they need a bit of professional help. So get in touch with me and we can sort it out. And thanks for Douglas Coleman for giving me the spot. Thanks a lot. Cheers, bye.
And now...
Hey, Rocky, watch me pull a rabbit out of my hat.
Again?
Nothing up my sleeve. Presto! Ooh, don't know my own strength.
Now here's something we hope you'll really like.
Okay, please welcome to the Douglas Coleman Show, Tim Rymel. Hi, Tim. How are you?
Good, Douglas. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you for coming on. I appreciate it. I was kind of fascinated by your bio and wanted to have you on the show. I've heard a lot about what you went through and perhaps were even involved in the process. You were an evangelical Christian minister for 25 years, and according to your bio, says 6 years at what was once the world's oldest and most renowned ex-gay ministry. You were also a conversion therapy survivor. A lot of us heard about this when the election was going on. Michelle Bachmann, right, and her husband, I kind of forget his name now, but Was this part of that pray the gay away thing?
It was. There are 3 different segments of this. You've got the ex-gay ministry, which I was a part of and which happened earlier in the process. And then it became this conversion therapy, which was a kind of a collusion between read the Bible and more psychotherapy. And then reparative therapy is something that is generally done by practitioners who will pull you into an office and they talk about how you're disconnected from your father, or women are disconnected from their mothers. So it has kind of morphed through the years into something that's quote unquote a little more professional, I guess they would like to call it.
Give me an example of conversion therapy, because to me, I can't even imagine trying to convert somebody who is gay. I mean, it seems to me it's rather like trying to change someone's eye color. You know, you can put funny contact lenses on and make your eyes look a different color, but underneath, they're going to be whatever color you were born with. And I can't even imagine. So give me an example. What was the conversion therapy all about? What did they do?
Well, first of all, that's a pretty good analogy. I like that analogy. For us, again, it was a different time. So when I went into conversion therapy back in 1990, I had grown up in the Evangelical church. So really, going into conversion therapy for me was an extension of that theological belief that homosexuality is a sin and that whatever we ask of God, he will grant us. So it was a natural, just a natural combination of course, if you're gay, you'd pray and then God will take that away from you and God will make you quote unquote whole. And he will, not so much make you heterosexual, but that you're going to live a life that is worthy of him and pleasing to him, and then the kids and the wife and all those things that are normal will come to you. So that's how it came to me. So, I've often said that really conversion therapy is a symptom of a much bigger issue going on within the evangelical fundamentalist church, because there is this idea or ideology that we have a certain way to live, gender is a certain way, you're supposed to act a certain way, everybody has a role. So this just kind of comes out of that, is that of course you cannot be gay because the Bible says clearly that you cannot be gay. So it all kind of goes together. So for me, being in ex-gay ministry like I was, it was a lot of Bible reading. It was a lot of accountability. It was sharing and talking to people who were in a similar situation where we would share our stories. And there was something about being in that environment for the very first time when a person struggles so deeply with this feeling of not being normal, no one really understanding, feeling separated, being both a Christian and having same-sex attractions. So it was a different time and a different place, and I think we have learned and grown from that. But there are still many ministries and organizations still practicing conversion therapy or some variation of that.
Hasn't conversion therapy been discredited largely by psychiatric associations and basically the general public at this point?
It has been discredited by every major psychiatric, psychological, educational, medical association, and has been for many years. And what I didn't know going into it in 1990, of course, it was because of my faith, was that we knew this from the 60s. From the 1960s and 70s, the research that had been done showed that it was impossible to change someone's sexual orientation. But again, in that era, out of the early Christian Jesus movement, evangelical faith that had developed, through the decades, is that it didn't really matter to us because those secular people didn't know God. They didn't know what God could do. They didn't know what the Bible said. So we just saw that as them going against the Word of God, and what God was saying was truth. So, had my family even known what the APA was or any of this information, it really wouldn't have mattered because we felt like we had the truth, and we felt like this is something that you have to do to get healed and forgiven.
It seems to me, I'm going to go back to the conversion therapy thing because I have this mental image picture. You said that they would, if you had like group therapy, you'd have a whole bunch of people who were gay, who were in denial or just in complete shame and embarrassment about the whole thing. And you put them all together in a room and everybody talks about how awful they feel because they have these attractions and feelings. I don't imagine that helped anybody except the idea that it was like, well, I'm not the only one.
Yes, well, you're right. It didn't help anybody to fix anything, and they didn't leave any more straight than they came there. But what it did do was it brought us together. And when we got together, a lot of us, for the first time, myself included, were meeting people who were of a similar persuasion. You know, we all had the same beliefs. We all wanted to go the same direction. And we were able for the first time to talk about what it was like to feel the way that we felt and to discuss the shameful things that we did with others who understood what, had been through that experience. So initially, there is definitely that feeling of camaraderie, of unity, of healing, of that you're really doing something for God. So initially, that's the feeling that you get. So in my situation, I went to a residential program, and I don't even know if these are offered anymore, but we had residential houses. So you had about 12 guys that would move into these houses. And I know we always get the joke about you put 12 young gay guys together in a house and see what happens, right? It sounds like the beginning of a porn movie.
Well, it seems like an obvious situation. And they're all frustrated sexually because they're trying to repress, Okay, go ahead.
Right. But we got there because we had a purpose to be there. So it really wasn't this, orgy of things going on. It really was a lot of guys that were earnestly wanting to do what was right and what they felt their faith was telling them to do. In my particular situation, because we've got 2 to 3 to a room, you really have no alone time. So going into this room, pornography's off limits. You don't have a television. It's a lot of socializing with guys. With people, and the reason for that is you're socializing because you have to become this masculine person is what they wanted you to be. So they think that by putting all these guys together and you hang out with straight guys, that somehow this is going to rub off and it's going to change you to be more like them.
Yeah, that never worked.
Right.
Anybody who's gone to an all boys school,
right.
That just doesn't work. It's better if you mix the genders and let people have a little bit of delight. Keeps them more sane, I think.
Right.
There was a movie, actually a couple of movies, but about the Mormon missionaries, and it just reminds me of that because I think it's similar, perhaps, with the evangelicals. I don't know that much about evangelicals, but was Billy Graham evangelical?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It was ridiculous because these guys are 18 years old, at the peak of their sexual drive, and they're trying to repress all of these feelings. And then they send them off with another guy who the other one is attracted to and stick them in a little room with no TV, like you said.
Right.
What do they expect is going to happen? It's just unbelievable. The one thing that I've always been curious about, and I know there's not really an answer, but maybe you have a theory. I'd be interested to hear it. Is there actually a cause for homosexuality? It's the old nature versus nurture question. Or is there some kind of a biological gene that they can find one day maybe in our DNA?
Well, I think that's the million-dollar question. There is a lot of very compelling research when you start looking at our brains and how our brains develop. There was a new study, or not a new study, but this has been going on for a while, but something just came out where they were talking about if you match the brain of someone who's transgender male to female, and you look at a female brain, you see some similarities in the brain structure. So we are seeing some things that happen. One of the most compelling researches that I read is that they say that women who are more fertile and will have more babies is that there's a higher chance of having gay children in that. And the more brothers, the more chance of having gay children. So they're saying that there is something with the wash of hormones at the time that, at the time that we're born. So the studies have been between, when they look at rats, is that they can change hormones in rats. And so once the rat has been born, there is this period of time where they can change their sexual orientation. So, but it doesn't happen like that with humans because it happens before we're born. So that wash of hormones, they're thinking, is what makes a difference in how the baby is born and how it comes out. So there are definite biological things happening to us. I think it's going to be pretty complex, where it's going to talk about the neurology, the biology, the epigenes, what gets triggered. I think there's a lot more to it. I mean, what we do know is that people definitely are born gay. We just don't know how exactly that happens.
Well, it's interesting when they did studies on identical twins, where
Yes.
one, and I remember this one, it was two boys and they were maybe 6 or 7 years old. And one was seemingly incredibly macho and straight, and the other one liked to play with dolls and was quite feminine. And, you know, it seemed pretty obvious how they were going to grow up. You don't know, but because that sort of blows the environmental argument out the window. Because it was same mother, same father, same environment, born at the exact same time, and yet their personalities were completely opposite. So if it is any kind of a hormonal thing or any kind of a DNA, in other words, it definitely separated. Something was different between the two. But it'd be interesting if they could actually figure out what it was.
Yeah, you know, but I think that's looking at sexuality altogether as what drives us to be the way we are. And it's not as cut and dry as we once thought it was. You know, in my background, growing up as a conservative evangelical, we had very defined gender roles. And I think it's funny to this day because my sister, who was the feminist when she was 15 years old, she grew up to be a sergeant major in the Army. She's made grown men cry. She's married. She's got 2 kids. And it's just funny to me when we get together now at our age, we'll go to our parents' house and her and my mom are still in the kitchen, still making the food and doing all the things that women do. And then my dad and I are sitting in the backyard waiting for the food to be ready. You know, so it's just these very defined roles that we grow into, and we just feel that's right. So coming from my background in such a conservative environment, even though now I understand the research, I've read the research, I've written about the research, but there's still, because it's so ingrained in my biology about very defined roles, I still see it that way. I still struggle to, call somebody who's a transgender. My brain automatically refers to their birth gender instead of seeing them for who they are, because it's just so ingrained in my brain. So I have to make myself go, no, that person's a he, or that person's a she, or this person goes by they. So it's just, recognizing who they are is different than often how we perceive the world around us or how we thought it was supposed to be growing up.
Transgender is kind of a different issue, in my opinion, than homosexuality, because people that are gay, I don't think necessarily want to be the other gender.
No, those are 2 different things.
It's 2 different things.
Right.
But what confuses me about transgender is, okay, you have your biological gender, but what happened? Is it the hormonal thing again? Is it the DNA thing again, that it got in the wrong body essentially?
No, and I'm not an expert on transgender, so I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here, but there is research showing that there is definite brain differences between transgender men and women. So there are some differences that they're seeing. So again, this is something that's very misunderstood in our culture, because in our Puritan Elizabethan culture that really likes to define the way things are, it's not that way. We're not completely 100% male or female or completely gay or straight. There is a continuum that we fall on.
If somebody is born biologically a male, how do they differentiate between, I know this is going to sound a little bit silly, but how do they differentiate between just being gay and actually being transgender or wanting to be the other gender?
Well, again, those are 2 different things. So if you're talking about, sexual orientation,
because presumably the man who wants to be a woman is attracted to men, correct?
Well, no.
No?
No, that's not the case. Again, you can't mix their sexual orientation with their gender identity. So It's a matter of who you go to bed as versus who you go to bed with. So somebody who even wants to, if they're male to female transgender, then it doesn't mean that they are, when they become female, that they're going to switch and suddenly be attracted to men. So if they're attracted to women as a male, they'll likely be attracted to women as a female. And I wrote about this. There's a Huffington Post article. Oh, this one is on Goodman Project. Sorry. I wrote a Goodman Project article where it talks about genotypic, phenotypic sex, gender identification. And it just breaks down all of the differences between those things. So, and again, I'm not an expert on this, so it's really difficult for me to go into all of the types, but there are chromosomes, there are the biology, and then there's the brain, and then there's how we identify, and then on top of that, you've got all the cultural things that kind of affect us and move us in different directions. So there's a lot of things that go into this. It's a very complex issue.
I didn't mean that question to sound so ignorant as it might have, because I don't really feel that way. I'm just kind of asking you for the sake of people who have no idea. Anyways, let's see. I was going to ask you about, how did you get out of this whole evangelical conversion therapy thing? At what point did you have the epiphany that just said, all right, you know what? This isn't going to do it. I got to get out of this.
Right. It took me a long time. The epiphany didn't come until 6 years after my wife divorced me. And that was because when I was in conversion therapy, and I had grown up in the evangelical church. That was my childhood. I didn't know anything differently. I was a teenager before I ever went to something that wasn't Pentecostal. And I remember going into a Baptist church, and I just remember it was so quiet. And I had been raised to believe that other people had religion, but we had a relationship. So when I saw how quiet it was, it didn't, none of that made any sense to me, because our church was very emotional. There was a lot of yelling and, in a sense that it was just loud. So heavy praise. I was a gospel musician for 25 years, so I was in black churches, traveling, doing all this stuff. So that was my upbringing. That's just what I was used to doing. So seeing something different it didn't really resonate with me. So I really felt like I had this very deep relationship with God. So when I went into the ministry, I was trying to be the person that God wanted me to be, because I believed that homosexuality was a sin. After I finished the ministry, I went onto the leadership staff, and I spent the next 6 years. And it was at a time in the 90s when this cultural war between the religious right and the LGBT community was heating up. So we were suddenly dragged into this media frenzy where our ministry staff was appearing on ABC News, Good Morning America, Oprah Winfrey. So we were doing all of these shows, traveling across the country, doing all this speaking, which was a very exciting time. And we felt like this message of freedom from homosexuality through Jesus Christ was real. It was relevant. It was who we were. We weren't trying to lie. We weren't trying to be something we weren't. And what you saw on stage is pretty much what you saw when we were in our office. But you learn to temper what it feels like to have those feelings. So, and what I mean by that is that, of course, we were attracted to the same sex, but we would confess that because that was a sin, that was a temptation. And we just learned how to just continue to push those feelings down. And by the time I left the residential program and went into the ministry, I'd gotten really good with pushing these feelings down. I didn't have any sexual attraction at all. It just went away. So I perceived that to be healing. So I got married. We had 2 children. And I left the ministry after we had relocated to Memphis because the media attention had dried up, and I was the outreach director, so my job was really going to churches and coordinating the events and who would go where. And when we got to Memphis, Tennessee, we moved there because it was more conservative, but we discovered that not only do they not want to talk about sex, they don't want to talk about gay sex at all. So there was no place to go. So I got married. I left the ministry in 96. I went to work for Youth for Christ, and then I was a music minister at a church in Memphis, and my wife wanted to be closer to her family in Sacramento, so we ended up moving back to Sacramento. And then about a year or so after we were here is when she announced her divorce. So I think she knew clearly that I was not who I said I was or who I wanted to be. So in our marriage, at that point, I really struggled to know what truth was. I didn't know my own identity. I was trying to fit myself into this mold of heterosexual husband, and our relationship, as you can imagine, was not very deep. There was just this wall that I couldn't seem to cross with her. So because of that, and things, of course, were very rocky in our relationship anyway, is that she met somebody else and told me she wanted a divorce. So I rallied her family to my side because she was breaking up our marriage. She was being ungodly, all of these things that I could easily pin on her because it still went with my narrative of what I believe God wanted for me and for my life. So she left, she divorced me. Her family was on my side. I was with, her mom and I were close. Her mom was giving me books on spiritual warfare, which I was reading. And so during that 6-year time period, I was so depressed that I just kind of cocooned myself off. So I was working as a trainer, traveling around the country, and that's when I started to rethink, maybe I'm wrong. But it was a good 6 years before I thought, okay, maybe I am gay. So between 1996 and when I left the program was another 10 years, in 2000, I guess around 2006 or so, when I started to rethink what was even true about my life and started to question who God was. And that was something that I could never do. I often tell this story about sitting in the NPR room when my book Going Gay came out, and she asked the question, when I was in the ex-gay ministry, did I ever at any time say, oh no, I really am gay? And my head just started spinning in this room because I thought, no, I could never at any time when I was in the ministry say, no, I really am gay, because that would mean that the Bible was wrong. And of all things that happened, the Bible was right and God was right, and that was what I stood on. So things started to fall apart at that point after my wife left, and I had at this point was so depressed I was crossing over this line between sanity and insanity. I really didn't know what was going on at times and was so close to suicide. I just thought something has to give. Now I've got 2 kids I'm trying to raise as a single dad. And that was the first time when I started asking the question, does God even exist? So from that point on is when, when I started to just deconstruct this whole belief system, and I jumped into the sciences. I wanted to know about biology, archaeology, history. Where did my religion come from? How did I get here? In graduate school, I studied cognition and transformative learning to know how do we change from this, way of thinking to this way of thinking. And I looked at the neurology behind that. And so that really was the beginning of this entire process of change for me.
It's interesting because religion is something that I know the whole world is still at war about. And people take it very seriously. But it's basically, in my opinion, religion is nothing more than a script on how one can live their life. And as long as you follow the rules, at the end, when you die, everything's going to be wonderful. This is what they say. You're going to go to heaven, or, there's different versions of it, but it's all kind of the same thing. The problem with it is the judgmental aspects of it, where it's okay if you want to live your life that way, but if somebody else doesn't, it doesn't mean that they're bad, or it doesn't mean that they're, somebody you shouldn't associate with. There's a real intolerance with religion, particularly in America, I think, and probably the Middle East. I would have to throw some of the radical Islamic people in the same group as with the evangelicals and the hardcore Baptists and stuff, where just the intolerance is unbelievable. And to me, I've never wanted, being a sort of a free-spirited person, I've never wanted that confine. It's like having braces on your brains because you can't think for yourself. The script is just laid out for you. Here you go. Read this and follow every word, and this is how it's done. But on the other hand, do you think we as a society, and I don't mean just America, but the whole world society, do you think people are still at the point where they need some kind of direction? The whole thing about being sheep. Not everybody is a leader, and people need something to believe in. Do you think religion serves that purpose well, or do you think it's just disillusioning everybody?
All right, let's. You said a lot there, so let's unpack this a little bit.
Okay.
According to the latest Pew research, 90% of Americans believe in God or some sort of higher power. And I believe it was 53%, if I remember that number correctly, believed in the God of the Bible. When you start looking at what that means exactly, especially when you start breaking down that number of 53% believe in God of the Bible, we can go all different directions. There's over 41,000 different sects and denominations of Christianity. So the question is, which part of God or how do you believe God to exist. We're not going to get away from the belief in existence of God. That's not going to happen. And I have a lot of atheist friends, and there's a lot of what I would call fundamentalist atheists, where they just want to push this message of God doesn't exist. We've got to separate church and state. That's not going to happen. If you look at evolution, we have this thing inside of us that has to explain things away. And because we're so young in science, we use God or the God gap to explain things that we don't understand yet. So I think that's going to happen for a very long time. I don't necessarily think it's a script that we follow. I think that we are handed a set of beliefs when we grow up, whether that is secularism or is some form of religion, and we never question that. Nobody ever sits us down and say, okay, well, here are the 12 major religions, and then here's atheism. Which one would you like to use? We're presented with the way our parents live, with the way that we grew up, and so we just automatically assume that that's what truth is. So as far as some of the fundamentalist religions go, whether it's Islam or it's fundamentalist Christianity, there is a deep-seated belief in hell that if we don't do exactly what God wants us to do, then we're going to hell. And for Christians, it goes a step further than that. Because if I don't stand up and I don't pray for you and I don't tell you what you're doing wrong, then I'm going to go to hell and God is going to be very angry with me. So a lot of the judgment that we perceive from them, well, it is there. A lot of the judgment that we get from these individuals is based on this deep-seated fear of we have to do this the right way or God is going to be very angry.
Isn't that arrogance disguised as fear? I mean, that has got to be the most arrogant attitude in the world.
Yeah, anytime you have somebody who claims to know all truth, that's an arrogant attitude.
Yeah, but the way you were explaining it, it's explained to the person as a fear.
Yes. Well, I don't think we see it as fear. In the Christian faith, we call that love. I love you, so I'm going to tell you this because I love you. And it's the same kind of love that says, God loved you so much, he sent his son to die for you, but if you don't do it, he's going to send you straight to hell for you to burn for all of eternity. Right? So it's this abusive relationship with God, with love, where I don't think they're capable of thinking for themselves, as I wasn't either. Again, I had to believe that the Bible was true, because if the Bible wasn't true, my entire world would fall apart. And I was holding it together with bubblegum and masking tape for many, many years, trying to fit into this mold that I was taught and needed to believe to be true. So when we were traveling and speaking and doing all these shows, we needed to believe that for our own sanity and religious safety, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense, but it's my head's kind of spinning with this whole idea now, because I'm thinking, this is so screwed up, and it's psychosis masquerading as, the word.
Yes.
That's how I'm
exactly
seeing
right.
it. That's how I'm seeing it. And I didn't grow up in a particularly religious family. My grandfather went to church every Sunday and he sang in the choir, but he never, ever talked about religion. This was like his own private affair. I went a couple of times just because he asked me to go, but nothing was ever shoved down my throat. No preaching. It was more like a social club, really. And then they'd all have Sunday lunch after the service,
Right.
And then I thought, okay, that's fine. That's good. To me, that's the way people should be with it. But when it starts to become political and it starts to become a way of life that has to be imposed on the masses, I mean, I can see why it happened thousands of years ago, because it was a way of controlling the masses. The great idea of the meek shall inherit the earth, and the rich man who's sitting on the mound of gold says, don't worry, when you die, you're going to get it. But nobody knows what happens. So in the meantime, the rich man is living fat and large, and the peasants are struggling their whole life with this faith that in the end, they're going to get it, that they're going to be the ones rewarded. That's the best mind control in the world. That's the best way to control your society. Absolutely. So if religion was created for that purpose, it certainly served its purpose. But what's happened now is that the world is far more diverse than it was 2,000 years ago, and also a lot more people. Right. And now science is slowly catching up, And little by little, science is sort of eating away at it. You know, Darwin was probably one of the major steps in the last few hundred years. And I don't know, you said that it's going to be with us for a long, long time. I'm sure in our lifetime, but I think at some point people are going to go, wait a minute. You know, this is irrelevant. This is nonsense. This is cuckoo.
I think that's happening now, especially with the younger generation. The millennials are the fastest group that are stepping away from church, but there's still a belief in some kind of higher power. And there's even a belief among atheists and agnostics who say, I'm an atheist or agnostic, but if you can provide evidence, I could change my mind. Or if you, or I do. And it was interesting. I can't remember what study I read, but it was, there was, even for atheists and agnostics, there was a belief in hell for some of them. You know, so I think as a human race, there is something that developed. And if we go back 400,000 years, we see that there are religious symbolism that you can find in cave paintings. And as we progress, you see that things change. And again, I think a lot of it was based in the unknown, and we are learning a lot more than we used to. But we are not very far from animals, and you don't have to look very far beyond the current administration to see where we are. You know, where there's so much anger and hatred at races or people that we don't understand, and so we have reverted back to this tribalism, and we're all doing it. You know, liberal or conservative, we're all reverting back to this tribalism where we're right, they're wrong. So you see us kind of going back to this, and in the mix of that, again, is this ideology of religion, and what exactly does it mean? The issues with evangelicalism or fundamentalist religion is that it comes from this perspective of this almighty God who has told us a truth. So anytime you see any faith or any religion who claims to hold all truth, you're going to have problems. For evangelical Christianity, particularly in America, evangelicalism developed in the early 1700s. So in the 18th century, this is when it started to develop out of the Puritan movement in the United States. We have a very unique perspective of Christianity in the United States. Most of that stayed relegated into the South, and it wasn't until the 1925 Monkey Scopes trial, and that trial was basically about a teacher that was teaching evolution in a class in Tennessee, and so the state of Tennessee, and it was all staged to bring this to the forefront in American life, but they sued him and said, no, you can't do that. And then it was overturned on a technicality, but the purpose of that trial, the Scopes Monkey trial, was just to bring this idea of evolution to the forefront. And what happened at that point was that the modernists, which sounds like more like your grandfather, and the fundamentalists separated. So now you had this modernist Christianity religion, which was at peace with science and diversity and bringing all of these things in, and took more social justice stance with the fundamentalists who went off into the South. They stayed in their own ghettos, and they believed that the Bible was inerrant, that the Bible was literal, and so those were the things that they preached. So all of that began to change during the Dust Bowl period, when you had a mass migration of people that were moving from the South to California and across the states looking for work. So by 1969, there were more Southerners actually living in Southern California than there were in the entire state of Arkansas. And with them came this religion, this fundamentalist ideologies, and then they started tapping into Ronald Reagan. So when Ronald Reagan became governor, he was giving the religious right what they wanted. They came together again in the 1970s when the federal government went against segregation, and so the white evangelical churches, they started their own schools. The federal government saying you're going to lose money if you don't integrate those schools. So they came together for that purpose and united. So by 1979, they had created this massive voting bloc that had never been tapped into before. Between 1979 and 2016, the last election, it has become a massive power. And the issue, there are many issues with this, but one of the big ones, of course, is that when you, again, believe that the Bible is the literal interpretation of God, and you believe that what you're doing in regards to immigrant status, in regards to guns, in regards to whether you should kneel or stand for the flag, all of that gets mixed with what they believe about their theology. So there's no discussion, there's no compromise, because no matter what the issue is, they believe that they are standing firmly on what God said about that issue.
How did the evangelicals justify their ideals of segregation.
I mean, if you look at the Bible, there is no, never at any point, Old Testament or New, does it ever say anything about slavery. It condones slavery. It talks about how slaves should be treated. It talks about how slaves should respond to their masters, but it never at any point does it say there should be no slavery. And there are different passages and verses that talk about where the Jews are supposed to be kept safe, that they they're a holy people, they're a separate people. So we, growing up in the Christian faith, were always taught you're a holy people, you're a separate people, don't get involved with the affairs of the world. So there was very much this idea of segregation. And I just finished an article that I submitted to another publication on this idea. And if you look at the history of this, Jerry Falwell Sr. as well as Bob Jones Sr., both of them preached sermons back in the 60s and 70s that said if we allow integration into our schools, the human race will be destroyed and that God will bring down his judgment on this nation. So you do see in the history of evangelicalism where there is this belief that there absolutely should be a separation. So now we're seeing the same thing. If you fast forward 30 years, you look in the 1990s when Love in Action was doing its thing, is that you had a lot of people who are still saying if you allow gay people to get married, if you normalize the LGBT quote unquote lifestyles, then you're bringing God's judgment. God is going to judge this nation. And a lot of them will refer back to the Roman history where they say it was because of promiscuity that the Romans were destroyed. So it's a total lack of knowledge of history, but they're pointing back to these different eras, and then they're using these scriptures to validate what they're saying in order to prove their point. And again, it's difficult to get them to see anything differently because they already believe that they have all truth in their hands.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about American society, and then we'll get to your books or your new book. If you've ever traveled outside of the United States and gone to a very sort of homogenous type country like Japan or China or the Middle East, and even some countries in Europe, there's a strong social fabric that runs within that society. Typically, they're the same race, they're the same religion, and it's easier to have an orderly, law-abiding society with people like that because it's easier to get them all to agree. In America, we've got people from everywhere and every belief, all under presumably one flag and one government and one constitution. Religion was, for a long time in America, the strongest thread of our social fabric. Now it's starting to unravel. What can we use in America to sort of unite us all so that we don't have complete anarchy and this whole idea of individualism and freedom doesn't just completely fall apart?
Yeah, I think that's why it's this is the great experiment to see how that's going to work in this democracy.
If it's going to work.
Where, it's a pluralistic democracy with very strong religious ties. And again, if you look back at the history, and this was interesting writing the book, is that you do see where all of these religions came. The Puritans came over to America because it was a new place and they needed to get away from the persecution in England. And when they got here, they developed their own unique places. So in one place you had the Puritans where they didn't allow Catholics. Another place you had the Catholics where they didn't allow Jews. So you saw these different segments. And I can't remember the quote exactly, but I believe it was James Madison that said, clearly if you say that one part of Christianity is okay, and we do that as part of the, making this a Christian nation, quote unquote, then you've got all of these other sects that at some point are going to be put out. And that's kind of what happened, is that you have the evangelicals saying, oh no, this is a Christian nation, it's always been a Christian nation. But the question is, what kind of Christian nation? Because we've been down this road before, where the Baptists are being persecuted and the Quakers are being imprisoned. Who gets to decide that? So if we're going to determine that this is a Christian nation, then what type of Christian nation is it? So 70% of us, do identify as Christians, but then you start to get to the breakdown of what exactly does that mean to you? And if you're a biblical Christian, then what does that mean to you? How far down do you go? Are you a literalist, or do you just pick and choose? Do you have stories that you like? I mean, at what point do we say, no, it's going to be this? So for our society, I don't have an answer to your question. I don't. It is different. We are diverse. California is one of the most diverse, and as a Californian, I think it runs pretty smoothly. But I know that there are different segments within the state that, of course, see things differently. But I think it's dangerous if we allow any type of religion to get into our government decisions, because then it becomes irrational.
Well, there is the theory of separation of church and state in this country, where I don't think other countries, in fact, I've never been to one where there was that, even as an idea. With England, it's tied to the Church of England. The Queen is the head of state and also the head of the Church of England. A lot of other countries, Thailand, for example, the Buddhist holidays are national holidays. They're government holidays. It's all tied together as one thing. The state is the church or believes in the church, whatever their church is. Our country is unique that we have sort of made the theory to separate it. And I think to a certain degree we have. I think people nitpicked at it a little by little. Okay, no more prayers in public school because that's crossing the line. Don't put a nativity set up in front of the post office because that's crossing the line. We were talking about social fabric, and I think at best the United States is a patchwork quilt that we've just kind of pasted together as we've gone along. And I don't know. I don't really know. Like you said, it is the great experiment. It does seem to work in a weird sort of way. We certainly have our problems that are very unique to this country. But by and large, people tend to get along with each other. Maybe everybody is in their own little cocoon going through life. But I think overall we get along. Do you agree?
I would agree. But if you look at the divisiveness between the political parties, there was a separation that began in when you see the religious right getting involved. We become more polarized, especially in the 1990s. And I believe it was Jonathan Haidt in his book, The Righteous Mind. He talks about how Newt Gingrich, actually, when he became Speaker of the House, he told the Congress, okay, you guys can leave on Thursdays and go home with your family. And he said prior to that time, Congress had all been together. And so they were going to parties together, they were hanging out together, they were socializing. And so that really changed how Congress started working with each other because they became much less personable. So I do think that has had a lot to do with how we interact. And of course, there's social media. So we're getting less connected and making up our minds without really knowing who people are.
It's funny about internet technology because at first when the internet, began, and people started getting computers in the 90s, I thought this idea of, wow, we can talk to anyone, anywhere in the world. Isn't this great? And we have a new language. It's called Windows. And we can all communicate with that. And it has done that to some degree. But then when I saw the last election in this country, I thought, what the hell happened?
Right.
It's one of those one step forward, two steps back kind of things.
Right. Yeah.
Let's talk about your book before we run out of time. You've written 3 books. Everything I learned about management, I learned from having a kindergartner. That's hysterical. Going Gay. Tell us briefly about that one.
Going Gay, my second book, was my journey out of conversion therapy and the evangelical church and just trying to put all the pieces together. So when I wrote Going Gay, I really tried to do it from the perspective of a conservative Christian who's facing this difficulty of just coming to terms with who he is as a gay person. And so I do question theology. I question some of the things that I was, what I believe to be true, and just try to put perspective around that life. So some of it, and I've been told this, is that some of it sounds very judgmental, but I wrote it that way because that's what I felt. That's what I was going through at the time. And we talked about this earlier, is it does come across as judgmental when you believe you have all truth and you're trying to put that on other people. So, the paradox for me at that point was I was trying to come to terms with the fact that I was gay. At the same time, I had so much judgment around other people, around what being gay meant, and around gay bars and, how people acted. So all of this was kind of this culmination in the book of just walking through that process of finally coming to terms with who I was, being okay with who I was, and then trying to reconcile this very conservative faith with who I was. So that was that book.
Okay, and then your new book is called Rethinking Everything When Faith and Reality Don't Make Sense. The title is pretty self-explanatory, and I think we've kind of covered a lot of that in our conversation, but give us a quick synopsis of the book.
Rethinking Everything came out of the work that I started to do with other people and their families when they were also coming out or had gone through similar experiences. A lot of pastors, wives, women who were left because their husband left them because they were gay, or just people who had been through a divorce, not even related to the LGBT issue. But I started meeting a lot of people that had kind of come to a similar place that I did, where things just were no longer lining up. Is that when they were kicked out of the church because they got honest, or they went through a divorce, or they had a kid that went off and did something else, things just stopped making sense for them. And for those of us that grew up in that era of the Jesus movement of the 60s and 70s and evangelicalism and televangelists, we were fed this belief system that we thought was true, that if we just did these certain things, that God would bless us and we would be at this place in life and we would have these spiritual things in life. And it didn't turn out that way. Life turned out to be completely different. So Rethinking Everything is a book where I went back and I laid out the idea of it's okay to ask those questions. We've been taught to ask questions only within a certain perimeter, but what happens when you question the entire box that you live in? And then I just went through and talked about, as a Christian, these are the things that we face. So I started back at the beginning. I know we alluded to this earlier, but I started back at the beginning of where did religion even come from? And I went back, I looked at archaeology, I talk about Christianity and Judaism, I talk about the canonization of Scripture, how that was developed, how the idea that we so firmly believe in the triune God, the Holy Trinity, was actually a heresy at the beginning of the church. So there are all of these things that we didn't know, that we sort of believe that our faith, our Christianity has always been that way from the time of Jesus, and you find out that that's not at all true. So, once you kind of come to terms with that, where do you go? So then I go into just talking about how do you deal with the depression and the shame and the anxiety or your lost passion when, in my example, I spent almost 25 years in ministry. I traveled with all these choirs and I was speaking and doing all of these things, and suddenly that ended because I no longer believed it. So how do you find your passion again? Where do you go to, to kind of reset yourself? So the book really just walks people through this time that I believe that we're in as a nation. I think there's a lot of people in that same place who are just rethinking what they believe to be true. And I know some of that comes from the fact that Donald Trump was so supported by the religious right, and people are left wondering, what happened to my faith? What happened to love? And all of these things that we used to hold so dearly to us about, where we didn't believe in adultery. And now we're supporting a president who has all of these accusations against him and all of the things that has been proven to have done in the past. What do I do with my faith now? So that book just walks through all of these questions that we have, and hopefully helps people come out the other side of, whether they end up with some kind of faith or they end up with no faith at all. It just walks them through how to question and where to go from there.
What do you think defines a cult?
That's a question I asked somebody who was the leader of the International Cult Studies something or other, because I said, don't you think evangelical Christianity is a cult?
They're all cults if you want to define them, if you want to be nitpicky about it.
Right. And he said that's a fine line, because a cult typically has one leader and people follow that one leader, and then they're the one who set the rules. So Christianity, by definition, doesn't have a single leader, but there are several leaders and several big ministries, and there are several different aspects of it. So I don't think you can classify all of it as a cult. More progressive Christians don't seem to fall into line with that, but it does in some instances certainly walk in that fine line.
It's a gray area, because from your description of coming out of it reminded me of, and I think the term is called deprogramming.
Yes. When
they take these kids out of the cults. I mean, this was like a big thing in the 70s. I remember, kids would disappear and they would come back, and then they had to be deprogrammed. And they had to spend time in therapy to get away from whatever it was that they went through. But it sounds like you kind of came out the same way from this group, which is not called a cult, right?
Right. So let's put that in context. In my research in cognition in grad school, I guess one of the things that I discovered really was that we all develop what's called a cognitive schema. So we have a way of life. We have a set of beliefs, whether we are conservative or liberals or fall anywhere in that spectrum, or if we're neither of those things, and we just get up every morning and we go to work the same way, and we see these same people every day, and we do the things the same way. We've developed this schema, this way of thinking and way of believing. And a lot of us, even if it's not religion, do end up in harmful behaviors or harmful beliefs that we believe. A lot of people struggle with depression. They struggle with trying to fit in, or they struggle with shame. Shame is a national epidemic in the United States. So I don't think it's just the idea of Christianity. I think in my case, that was part of what the umbrella of what I had gone through. And there certainly were specific beliefs that I had to deal with. But I think if you just look at the human race as a whole, and particularly in America, which is, of course, is what I know the best, is that we all have these ideas and beliefs that are not healthy. And how do you get out of them? How do you address that? How do you even know where to go when that's all you've ever known? True.
Are you still in communication with that part of your life, your family and all?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. My parents are amazing. When I finally came out to them the second time in 2009, I then introduced them to my then boyfriend, now husband. And they absolutely adore him. He is, my mom said it's the daughter-in-law he always wanted. So, so they have embraced him. They're still very conservative, evangelical Christians, but, they love me. And that's how I was taught. I was taught about love for everything that happened after that. I was taught that God is love, and my parents exemplified that. So I haven't had any issues with my parents. The extended church part of that, I've lost a lot of friends coming out. But and I have a lot of other friends that have kind of taken their place. So it is what it is.
Well, I'm happy to hear that you're still in good standing with your parents and a good relationship, because I know a couple of people from my life who, literally disown their family because of when they came out as gay, the family, everybody fainted. And, started fire and brimstone, and you're going to burn in hell, and you're no longer my son, and that whole thing. And I'm actually surprised that you said that, because I thought originally I was going to say, I'm sure you haven't talked to them in 20 years or something.
Yeah, and let me just say for the listeners that on my website, on timrymel.com, I have a list of resources, because that is one of the most heartbreaking things I get in emails, and people will contact me about going through a divorce, or they find out they have a gay spouse, or their parents are no longer talking with them, or they're just coming out. I have a whole list of resources on my website they're all free resources. Their phone numbers, their contacts, their organizations that are in the area. So, I want to be supportive of that, and I want people who are going through something like that to find those resources and be able to contact somebody in their local area and get support, because it is very difficult. And I have been incredibly lucky with that, because you're right. I do get a lot of those, a lot of those emails saying, I don't know what to do. I don't know where to go. They won't talk to me. But there is help out there.
Well, that's great. Tim, we got to wrap this up. This has been a real interesting conversation. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Best of luck. How long has the book been out?
Going Gay came out in 2014. Rethinking Everything is due to come out this fall, so they can sign up for the newsletter. And they can go to rethinkingbook.com, or they can go to timrymel.com and sign up down there, and I'll just keep them up to date on what's happening and let them know as soon as that book comes out.
Okay, and the Going Gay book and the other one, they're available on Amazon and...
Yep, Going Gay and Everything I Learned from Having a Kindergartner is available on Amazon.
Great. Okay, Tim, thanks so much for coming on the show. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Well, that's about all the time we've got for the show today. I want to thank my special guest, Tim Rymel. This is Douglas Coleman saying goodbye.